The salty spray stings as the wind howls through the rigging, and the creaking of the ancient ship echoes like a heartbeat in the vast, unforgiving ocean. Sailors clutch tangled ropes, those vital 13 knots of life, struggling to tame the wild sea. Each knot, each maneuver, could save them in a storm, or hold them together in despair. Behind these brave faces lies a world of relentless danger, towering waves biting cold, and the endless horizon that tested every ounce of human endurance. These sailors weren't just explorers, they were survivors, fighting against nature's fury with nothing but their skill and courage. Their stories echo through time, reminding us of the fragile yet fierce human spirit that pushed the age of exploration forward. If you're fascinated by those daring journeys and want to learn more about the human side of maritime history, subscribe now to reach 3,000. Drop where you're watching from and tell us, are you connected? You ever get chills just imagining how it felt to stand at the bow of a creaking colonial ship? The salty spray hitting your face, the icy wind slicing through your clothes, and the endless horizon stretching out like an open wound. The air, thick with the scent of wet wood, tar, and the stench of sweat and salt. That's the reality for those sailors during the age of exploration, an era when voyages could last months, sometimes years, pushing human endurance to its absolute limits. Today, we're gonna uncover the gritty details of life aboard those ships, especially how sailors managed to survive using just a simple knot. Yeah, those 13 knots of rope. They weren't just accessories, they could be the difference between life and death. We'll explore how ships were built, the brutal conditions crews endured, and the technical marvels that made long voyages possible. Prepare to step back in time, to feel the cold wood beneath your feet, hear the constant creak of the hull, and smell the mix of seaweed, sweat, and gunpowder. First, let's talk about the ships themselves. Colonial vessels like the carrack or the galleon were massive. Floating machines, built predominantly from two main materials, oak and pine. Oak was prized for its strength and durability, but was heavy. Pine, lighter but softer, was used for masts and spars. These ships were assembled with a complicated web of planks, nailed down with iron and tree nails, wooden. Pegs that expanded in the hull, sealing gaps and making the vessel watertight. Then came the rigging, hundreds of ropes, blocks and sails that sailors had to manage daily. These ropes, twisted from hemp, were the lifelines and the main tools for steering, hoisting and securing cargo. Imagine then what it was like to work with those ropes. The 13 knots of rope weren't just for tying cargo, they could be lifesavers in a storm or during a rescue. Sailors learned knots like the bowline, relevant for rescue, or the sheet bend, crucial when repairing sails or tying down cargo. These knots weren't just skills, they were safety protocols, their strength tested and trusted amid the chaos. Life on board was a relentless grind. Hierarchies were strict. Captains ruled with absolute authority, often a hard man who demanded discipline. The ship's crews were divided into ranks, officers who plotted courses and made strategic decisions, and the common sailors who handled the sails, maintained the hull and did the heavy lifting. Conditions, brutal. Imagine sleeping on planks in cramped, damp quarters, the constant noise of waves battering the hull, and the cold wind that cut through your clothes like a knife. The deck was a patchwork of mud, oil, and salt. Diseases like scurvy caused by vitamin deficiency decimated crews. Starvation was common when supplies ran low and fresh water was scarce. The navigation was rudimentary but vital. Sailors used the stars, the sun's position, and simple instruments like the astrolabe or quadrant to chart their courses. No GPS, just their skill, experience, and luck. When storms hit, the ship would shake violently. Lightning struck the mast, sails tore, and the crew would scramble to repair what they could, often with just those knots. The same knots that saved lives in calm waters could be the difference in a storm-tossed chaos. Rescue and survival hinged on these knots. Tying down sails during high winds prevented the ship from capsizing. Securing cargo prevented it from shifting and damaging the hull. In a storm, sailors would tie themselves to the rigging or secure themselves with a lifeline, a rope tied to a knot that could hold their weight if they fell overboard. These knots became literal lifelines. Think about the mental toll. Weeks at sea, with no land in sight, the horizon a constant reminder of the unknown. Men faced loneliness, fear of shipwreck, and the constant threat of death from starvation, disease, or storm. Yet they endured. The knots, they weren't just pieces of rope. They symbolized hope, security, survival. Ship construction was a masterclass in resourcefulness. When a plank cracked, they'd splint it with a piece of wood, bind it tight with a knot, and hope the patch held. When a sail ripped, the crew used spare canvas patched with whatever scraps they could find and tied it with knots that had been tested over centuries. Every knot, every lash, every tie was an act of human ingenuity and resilience. So, next time you see a simple knot, think of the sailors who depended on it amidst gales, loneliness, and despair. These knots could be tiny lifelines, literally saving lives when everything else was uncertain. They remind us of the raw human spirit that pushed explorers across the oceans into the unknown, with nothing but their skills, their courage, and that humble 13th knot of rope. Can you imagine what it felt like to be crammed into a tiny, creaking wooden cage, the air thick with salt, sweat, and the stench of vomit? Imagine the freezing wind slicing through tattered sails, biting into your skin. The cold was an invisible assassin, and the constant threat of sickness haunted every breath. Imagine the howling of the sea, the relentless pounding of waves against the hull, as your world shrinks to a prison on the water. Today, we're going to dive deep into the brutal reality of life aboard those wooden giants during the age of exploration, where survival was a daily gamble. If you enjoy stories of daring and hardship, do me a favor, hit that like button now. If you're a history buff and want to learn how sailors survived that hellish voyage, subscribe and activate the notification bell. Now let's set the scene. It's the 15th to 18th centuries. Europe is obsessed with discovery, empire, and wealth. Ships are the key to all of it. These aren't cruise liners or modern cargo ships. No, these are fragile, slow, often poorly designed vessels built from up to 2,000 planks of wood, oak, pine, cedar, held together with iron nails and wooden pegs. They face the fury of the Atlantic, the Pacific, and beyond. The crews, usually between 20 and 100 men, often pressed into service, many with no real training in navigation or ship maintenance. The main problem? Mortality rates. It's shocking, up to 20% of sailors didn't make it home. Disease, starvation, storms, scurvy, all relentless killers. But what's even more terrifying is the human experience. You see, these journeys weren't just about geography. They were about suffering, endurance, and the fight to stay alive in a prison of wood and water. Now imagine yourself one of those sailors. You start the voyage with hope, a sense of adventure. But as the days stretch into weeks, the reality hits hard. The first problem? Malnutrition. Vitamin C deficiency causes scurvy, turning gum tissues into bleeding wounds. Gums swell, teeth loosen, and sometimes teeth fall out while you're biting into hard biscuits. Your gums bleed just from chewing, your breath turns foul, and your mind begins to spiral with worry. Will this be the day your gums bleed out or your teeth fall? That's if you survive the illness itself. And it's not just scurvy. The salty, damp environment fosters mold, fungus, and bacteria. Moldy bread, spoiled meat, and contaminated water. Imagine the stench, acidic, sour, and sharp. The crew's shared space becomes a breeding ground for sickness. Vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration are commonplace. Men would often become so weak that they could barely stand, their skin pale and clammy, trembling from fever and cold. But it wasn't only health issues. The ship itself was a deadly trap. The deck was slick with algae, blood, and feces. The constant motion of the ship made every step treacherous. Falling overboard? Deadly. And if the crew was unlucky, a storm could flip the vessel. Cruel, but real. Let's not forget, the ship's seaworthiness depended on materials and craftsmanship. Wooden hulls expanded and contracted with the weather. Nails would rust and leaks would form. To patch these, sailors used pitch and tar, sticky black substances that made the ship look like a giant oily beast. These repairs were often jury-rigged, fragile, and temporary. The constant threat of sinking loomed, especially when storms struck and the crew was exhausted and malnourished. During storms, the noise was deafening. The wind howled like a banshee, rain lashed the timber, and waves crashed over the bow like monstrous fists. The crew would be thrown about like rag dolls, their hands gripping frayed ropes. The cold seared to the bone, Imagine the shivering, teeth chattering so violently your fillings might jump loose. Some sailors would get frostbite, fingers black and dead, toes numb and swelling painfully. And yet, survival often required ingenuity. Men resorted to desperate measures, biting into hardtack, the ship's basic biscuit, which was so tough it could be used as a weapon or a doorstop. They drank brackish water, which made their thirst worse, or cleared out the bilge, the lowest part of the ship, to find fresh rainwater. A dangerous, disgusting task. Bilge water was filled with oil, feces, and rotting wood. Many sailors got sick just from drinking it. To make matters worse, the psychological toll was staggering. Imagine the mental stress knowing that if you got sick, your chances of survival plummeted. The constant fear of shipwreck, the horror of seeing friends succumb to scurvy or drown. Men's mental states would fray, their nerves shattered. Some went mad, screaming into the stormy void. Others resigned themselves to their fate. But survival was not just about enduring sickness and storms. It was also about the tools and techniques they used. Sailors relied on simple yet vital instruments, compasses made from lodestone and brass, sandglasses to measure time, and rudimentary maps scribbled with charcoal. Navigation was a gamble, using the stars and the sun, often under the influence of storms or fog. They trusted the skill of seasoned sailors who could read the ocean's signs, how seabirds circled, the color of the water, the smell of the air. And all of this happened on ships that in many cases were nicknamed floating prisons. The crew was tightly packed, sometimes sharing hammocks that swung wildly in the storm, separated only by thin curtains. Dirty, cold, and hungry, they depended heavily on each other. Fellowship, even friendship, became a lifeline amidst the chaos, but cruelty and despair also lurked below deck, as petty disputes turned deadly and discipline was maintained through fear. So, when you think about the explorers and sailors of that era, remember, they faced not only the unknown, but a living nightmare on every voyage. Their bodies and minds were pushed beyond what we can imagine today. They endured the cold, the hunger, the sickness, and the terror, all to open a door to new worlds. If you want to know exactly how these brave men managed to survive such hellish conditions, what they ate, how they patched their ships, the medical tricks they used, there's a detailed story right here in the next part. Trust me, it's a wild ride through the brutal truth of maritime exploration. And hey, don't forget, these stories aren't just about the past, they show us what resilience really looks like, how humans can adapt, endure, and survive the impossible. Stay tuned. Imagine yourself on a ship in the 16th or 17th century, out in the vast, unforgiving ocean. The sun beats down mercilessly during the day, then vanishes into the black void at night. The salty air is sharp, cutting your skin like a blade. The creak of the wood, the slap of waves against the hull, it's a constant soundtrack of peril. But beyond the storms and sickness, there's another nightmare lurking. The relentless struggle to keep your ship afloat, seaworthy and alive. And believe me, it's a story of ingenuity, desperation, and human resilience. First, let's talk about the backbone of survival, the ropes. They're everywhere. These ropes, made from hemp or manila, could stretch up to 2,000 trees worth. Imagine that, a tangled forest of fibers, each one as thick as your arm. These ropes weren't just for sails. They were your lifeline. Break one and your whole ship could fall apart. Sailors would double and triple the thickness by braiding and splicing them. They'd replace frayed sections using the 13 knots, a series of specialized knots that could mean the difference between patching a leak or losing the entire mast. The knots were simple, but their strength was legendary, each one tested in the brutal reality of sea life. But it wasn't just about the ropes. The real challenge was the ship itself, wood that warped, cracked, and sometimes disintegrated. Wooden. Ships of that era, even the giant galleons, were built to last, but they demanded constant care. The salty air and relentless sun worked together like a corrosive cocktail, eating away at the timber. Sometimes a hull would develop leaks so big that water seeped in faster than the crew could bail it out. Imagine the frantic rush, buckets sloshing, men coughing from the salt spray, their muscles trembling from exhaustion. The solution? Patching with pitch and tar, sealing leaks with strips of oakum soaked in boiling tar. But that was just a temporary fix. The real answer? Frequent. Repairs. Sometimes even in the middle of a storm with waves crashing over you and wind ripping at your clothes. And yet, one of the most terrifying threats was the ship's rudder, an essential piece for steering through storms and into safe harbor. But what happens if the rudder's damaged? The crew had to get creative. They'd lash a spare piece of wood onto the broken rudder, using thick ropes or even chain links. Sometimes sailors would craft a makeshift steering oar from a single massive plank, roughly 15 feet long, secured to the ship with heavy iron fittings. It was a crude solution, but it worked. The problem was these repairs were fragile. A rogue wave or a sudden storm could snap it all apart, leaving the ship helpless and drifting into the unknown. Now, here's where things get even more intense. Imagine a sailor named Marco, caught in a storm with a cracked hull. He and his mates are patching the leak with whatever they can: oakum, tar, even pieces of broken ship's planking. It's freezing cold, and they're soaked to the bone. Their hands are numb, their gums bleeding from the salt, and they're praying that the patch holds long enough to reach land. But not long after, the ship's mast snaps in half. The sails are torn, and suddenly they're adrift, lost in the vast darkness, with no idea where they're headed. That's when the real improvisation begins. One of the most crucial tools in their survival toolkit was the 13 knots, a set of specific knots designed for different purposes. The bowline, the sheet bend, the clove hitch, they'd tie, untie, and retie constantly, improvising as circumstances demanded. These knots could secure a patch, lash a broken mast, or create makeshift pulleys for raising damaged sails. The sailors had to memorize these knots by heart. They were their lifelines in the chaos. And guess what? They'd often double or triple the strength by weaving the ropes into complex braids, making them nearly unbreakable even under stress. But here's the kicker. The materials themselves, hemp, oakum, tar, were often in short supply. When your ship's supply of fresh water ran out, you had to make do with what was left. Some sailors resorted to distilling seawater through primitive stills, boiling the salty water in copper pots. It was slow, inefficient, and sometimes contaminated with oil or debris. Dehydration, combined with scurvy and dysentery, was a common killer. Up to 20% of crews per voyage didn't survive the journey. Imagine the despair: grown men with sunken eyes, bleeding gums, and trembling hands. And when things got really bad, like a ship caught in a hurricane or a gale, you had to sacrifice. You'd loosen or reef the sails, reducing their area to lessen the strain. You'd ballast the ship with heavy objects, rocks, cannonballs, even the crew's own gear, trying to stabilize the hull. Sometimes the only choice was to ride out the storm, praying that the ship wouldn't break apart or be flipped upside down. It's cruel, but real. These sailors had no fancy storm shutters or stabilizers. They depended on their skill, their ropes, and a bit of luck. Now let's not forget the human toll. The constant cold, the salt, the stress. These took their toll. Gengivas sangrando, teeth falling out, skin cracked and bleeding. Men who started the voyage strong would emerge emaciated, their spirits broken, replaced by a hardened resolve. And yet, amid all that suffering, stories of heroism grew. A sailor patching a gaping hole with a scrap of sail, another risking his life to untangle a knot that could save the entire crew. These moments of ingenuity and sometimes desperation were what kept hope alive. Today, we have steel hulls, GPS, satellite weather reports. Back then, it was wood, rope, and human grit. If you want to see how close they came to death every day, just imagine the smell: wet wood, pitch, salt, sweat, and despair. The noises, the cracking of the hull, the roar of the storm, the screams of men trying to hold the ship together. It's a vivid, brutal scene. But these sailors, these explorers, they pushed forward. They made do with what they had, using their hands, their minds, their sheer will. And when the storm finally passed or the leak was patched, the crew would breathe a sigh of relief until the next problem knocked on their door. Because out there, in the endless blue, trouble never really leaves you. It waits, but so does resilience. These sailors, through their ingenuity and perseverance, proved that humans can carve out survival from the very fibers of their makeshift ropes. They transformed chaos into order, fear into courage. If you're curious about the specific techniques about how they tied those knots, patched those hulls, or crafted their makeshift steering. There's a whole world of detail waiting for you right here, because understanding their struggles helps us appreciate how far we've come. Today we take for granted the safety of modern ships and navigation systems, but back then, it was a constant fight, against nature, against death, and sometimes against hopelessness itself. So next time you think about those intrepid explorers and sailors, remember this: every voyage was an epic battle, a test of human ingenuity, endurance, and grit. The 13 knots, the tar, the hemp, these weren't just materials, they were tools of survival, the human stories behind them. That's what makes this history so captivating. It's about people, normal men and women, facing extraordinary danger and still finding a way to survive. Trust me, the real adventure isn't just in the discovery of new lands. It's in how humans fought to stay alive on that fragile, creaking prison of wood and rope, out there in the endless, merciless ocean. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a ship, hundreds of miles from land. The sun beats down mercilessly. Your skin feels the sting of salt and wind. The creak of the wooden planks beneath you is a constant reminder that you're part of a fragile prison, floating on the endless blue. Out here, every knot, every plank, every piece of rope becomes a matter of life and death. Today, I want to take you deep into the human side of these maritime adventures, where resilience was forged with every knot tied and every storm survived. Let's talk about something that sounds simple but was actually a matter of survival: the 13 knots. Not just a sailor's skill, but a lifeline. These knots, complex, sturdy, reliable, could mean the difference between sinking or surviving another day. Picture the tension, the sweat, pouring down sailors' faces as they worked through the chaos. They had to tie these knots with trembling hands, often in the dark, cold, or soaked in seawater. One wrong tie, one slip, your entire crew could be lost. Now imagine the scene during a storm at sea. The wind howling like a beast, rain slicing through the air like shards of glass, the ship groaning and shuddering under the assault. The crew soaked to the bone, their fingers slipping on the slippery hemp ropes, gums bleeding, teeth chattering from the cold, trying desperately to tighten a knot that might hold the hull or lash down a sail. These sailors knew that a poorly tied knot could spell disaster. People have died because of a loose line or a forgotten slip knot. And it wasn't just storms. Think about the constant threat of the ropes snapping under pressure, the wood swelling and cracking, or the ship riddled with leaks. When a hull was breached, cruel but real, the crew's only hope was patching it up with scrap wood, tar, and their own bare hands. They'd dive into freezing water, clutching onto floating debris, desperately trying to plug the leak. You could forget about comfort or safety. It was all about improvisation, grit, and raw willpower. Some stories are almost unbelievable. Imagine a sailor caught in a storm, his hand trembling from the cold, blood dripping from a cut caused by the sharp edge of a broken piece of wood. His comrades, exhausted and terrified, worked together to lash the broken plank with torn strips of sailcloth and cordage, desperate to keep the ship afloat. They tied knots in the dark, with the storm thrashing around them, trying to seal the wounds of their vessel and themselves. Let's not forget the psychological toll. These men and women, yes, women sometimes, faced the death of friends, the terror of sinking, and their own physical pain. Gengiva sangrando, teeth falling out from malnutrition, skin cracked and bleeding from exposure. Yet, they kept going, because surrender was worse than death. They became different people out here, tougher, scarred, but unbreakable. Every knot they tied, every patch they made was a testament to their resilience. Easily today, we protect ourselves with GPS, satellite radios, weather forecasts. We cruise in comfort, knowing that modern technology will keep us safe. But back then, it was raw, primitive, brutal. The sailors had no safety nets. The very fibers of their ropes held their future. If they failed, death was waiting just beyond the next wave. And what about the legacies of these forgotten heroes? Their stories aren't just about navigation or discovery. They're about human endurance, how ordinary men and women faced extraordinary dangers and refused to give up. Their sacrifice shaped the course of history, making possible the world we live in today. Without them, the age of exploration would have been a mirage, an illusion shattered by storms, hunger, disease, and despair. Because you see, every Not every patch, every small act of bravery on those ships was a chapter in the epic story of human persistence. To survive in that chaos, sailors had to be resourceful, courageous, and unyielding. They transformed chaos into order, fear into fierce determination. When a crew member's hands trembled as he tied that final knot, he was not just patching a hole, he was fighting for life itself. And that's the true legacy, the silent, often unseen bravery of those sailors, their sacrifice, their suffering, their resilience. Today, we may take for granted the safety nets that protect us, but back then, every voyage was a gamble, every knot was a lifeline, and knowing this makes us appreciate how far we've come, how modern ships, safety equipment, and quick communication keep us far from those deadly waters. So, think of the sailors who endured the bitter cold, the endless storms, the terror of sinking, armed only with their skill and willpower. They faced the chaos of the sea and came out stronger. Their stories remind us that human courage isn't just a modern trait. It's a timeless force, something that's carried us across oceans for centuries. And if you want to get a glimpse of how they did it, how they tied those knots, patched those hulls, and kept hope alive, I've got a whole world of stories waiting for you. Because understanding their struggles gives us a deeper appreciation of what it means to be human, facing the impossible and refusing to give up. So next time, you're on a modern ship, safe and secure, remember these sailors, the ones who face storms, hunger, and despair. Their courage, their sacrifice, built the foundation of our maritime history. And that, my friend, is a story worth telling and remembering. If you enjoyed this dive into the gritty, human side of colonial sea voyages, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories like this, and stay tuned for the next adventure, because the ocean's stories are far from over. Together, we honor the fearless explorers and sailors who dared to face the storm, to tie that knot, and to survive. Against all odds, their legacy lives on in every wave we ride today.